Rancher pulled a weak Bigfoot from a deadly mud pit. Then the shocking truth came out. He found it sinking in the mud, not a beast, not quite a child, just gray fur, shaking hands, and eyes begging for help. He could have walked away, raised his gun, but something in its silence, the fear, the pain made him stop. He pulled it out, fed it. Then one day, it brought him a berry. No words, no growls, just quiet and trust. Then came the storm. It vanished. He searched, found it hurt, trapped beneath fallen wood. He carried it home, healed it by firelight. And in that stillness, they shared something deeper than words. When it left behind a stone carved with a small hand. He saved it from the mud, but it saved him from something darker, the silence inside his soul. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city, where are you watching from tonight, and when the story ends. Don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. The last light of autumn hung low over the western hills. Mist drifted through the trees like smoke, and the air carried the damp scent of old rain and pine. Calvin Hayes walked alone through the silence, boots pressing into soft soil, the echo of distant crows weaving through the wind. It was supposed to be a simple evening, a short walk for firewood before the dark came down. But nature had other plans. At the edge of a shallow clearing, he stopped. The ground dipped into a wide pit of black mud, glistening under the dying sun. Then came a sound low, guttural, desperate. Not a growl, not a cry. Something in between. Calvin lifted his lantern. Inside the pit, a massive shape struggled weakly against the pull of the muck. For a moment, his mind reached for logic: a bear, maybe, or a lost elk. But then the creature turned its head. Two eyes met his wide, terrified, shimmering with life. Not wild, not empty, pleading. Calvin froze. Memories hit like gunfire, the swamp of war, the screams of men sinking in mud, hands reaching for him from the dark. He had walked away once. He couldn't do it again. He dropped his pack, tied a rope to a nearby stump, and threw it toward the creature. The mud hissed and clung to his boots as he waded in, muscles burning, pulling, slipping, fighting against the weight of death itself. When the rope finally gave slack, a body broke free from the pit small for its kind, shaking, gasping, alive. Steam rose from its skin in the cold air. Calvin stared, chest heaving. That wasn't a beast, he whispered. That was a child. Part 1. The Stranger in the Pit. Evening settled slow over the valley, rain whispering against the trees. The world smelled of wet leaves and smoke. Calvin Hayes crouched by the pit, his body trembling with exhaustion, his hands caked in mud. The rope he'd used to pull the creature free still trembled in his grip, slack now but heavy with what it had carried, the impossible weight of life. The creature lay collapsed beside him, half covered in muck, its chest heaving shallowly. Its fur, gray and matted, clung to the skin in clumps. Steam rose from it in the cold drizzle. Calvin's breath clouded before his face as he stared, unable to move. He should have been terrified. He was terrified. Yet what rooted him there wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The legends of Bigfoot had always belonged to the campfire stories for whiskey and distance, not for men standing within arm's reach. Now, that legend breathed at his feet. Calvin's instinct twitched. His hand went to his belt, fingers brushing the cold iron of his revolver. The creature stirred, a faint sound leaving its throat, a rough, broken moan, like someone too weak to scream. He froze. The rain grew heavier, pattering on leaves and pooling around them both. Its limbs shifted, slow and uncertain. The thing wasn't lunging, wasn't fighting. It was simply trembling. He watched its ribs rise and fall. Each breath looked like pain. Something deep within Calvin, older than reason, older than fear, told him to help. He holstered the gun. "Easy now," he murmured under his breath, though the words were useless against the storm. He reached into his satchel and pulled out his canteen. Kneeling beside the creature, he hesitated only a heartbeat before uncapping it. He set it near the creature's hand and stepped back. At first, there was no reaction. Then, slowly, the creature lifted its arm thick, trembling, almost human in shape. Its fingers brushed the canteen. Water spilled as it drank, clumsy but desperate. Calvin exhaled in disbelief. It was thirsty. It was afraid, but it wasn't violent. He turned, gathering a few dry branches beneath a nearby pine, and sparked a small fire. The smoke rose quick, carried by the damp wind. Orange light flickered across the creature's face, revealing more than he expected: scars, old and faded, lines of exhaustion across the brow. The creature turned its head toward the fire, then toward him. Their eyes met. Calvin had seen that look before in men dying on battlefields, eyes wide with something between pleading and apology. Not hatred, not rage. Just the silent question of whether someone would stay. He felt his chest tighten. "All right," he muttered, almost to himself. "You're all right." He took out a strip of dried meat from his coat pocket and laid it on a flat rock near the creature. The smell mixed with the rain and smoke. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, the creature sniffed, hesitated, and inched closer. Its fingers closed around the food, shaking. It ate in slow, deliberate bites, not wild, not ravenous, but careful, as if afraid it might be taken away. Calvin felt his heartbeat ease for the first time that night. He sat down near the fire, just far enough to keep space between them. The rain softened to mist, each drop hissing faintly against the flames. Time stretched. The woods around them seemed to breathe again. The creature's breathing steadied. It shifted slightly, curling in on itself, the fire's glow reflecting in its fur. It looked smaller now, fragile, almost pitiful. Calvin realized he'd been holding his breath. He studied the shape before him: massive shoulders, long limbs, a chest scarred with scratches. Not a monster. Not a myth. Just a being pulled from death's edge. He remembered the war again the night he dragged his commanding officer through swamp water. The same struggle against weight and mud. The man hadn't survived. He'd looked up at Calvin with the same eyes before the light left them. This time, those eyes were still alive. He swallowed hard, staring into the fire. His own reflection wavered in the flickering light, tired, hollow, streaked with mud and rain. The creature gave a faint sound, something between a sigh and a whimper, and lowered its head onto the ground. Its breathing slowed, drifting toward sleep. Calvin leaned forward slightly, uncertain whether to stay or move. Up close, He could hear it, a faint rhythm beneath the quiet, the slow, uneven beat of two hearts, his and its. He reached out, almost without thinking. His fingertips hovered over the creature's forearm. Steam rose off its fur, the warmth mingling with the chill of the night. Then it happened. Before he could pull back, one enormous hand twitched, then moved, fingers curling around his wrist. Calvin gasped. The grip wasn't strong. It was trembling, weak, and small in its intent not to restrain, but to hold. The contact lasted only seconds, but it struck through him like lightning. He could feel the tremor of life pulsing there, fragile and real. The creature didn't open its eyes. It simply breathed, clutching him like a child afraid to fall asleep. His first instinct to break free melted as quickly as it came. Calvin sat frozen, watching the firelight dance across their joined hands. Something in him cracked open the wall built by years of solitude, of guilt, of silence. He looked down at that hand, covered in mud and fur, and whispered, "You're safe now." The creature exhaled, long and shaky, as if understanding. Outside, the forest wind shifted. The rain had stopped. Only the faint hiss of steam from the fire and the soft rhythm of two heartbeats filled the night. Calvin stayed there until the lantern burned low, the world reduced to amber and shadow. When the creature finally released his wrist, it was already asleep. Calvin drew back his hand slowly, staring at the faint smear of mud it left behind, a mark that somehow felt heavier than any scar he carried. He leaned back, the firelight trembling in his tired eyes. Fear had left him. Something else had taken its place, quiet, heavy, and human. Compassion. He let the words settle in his chest like the last ember of warmth before sleep. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. Part 2. The Days of Silence. 3 days passed since the night of the rescue. The storm had moved on, leaving the forest slick and breathing again. The mornings came wrapped in silver mist, soft and wet, drifting through the trees like ghosts returning home. Calvin's cabin stood at the edge of that fog, quiet, weathered, alive only with the crackle of his small fireplace. He hadn't told a soul, not the sheriff, not his nearest neighbor 10 miles east. Some things, he figured, didn't belong in words. Every morning, he checked the edge of the woods. Mud prints were fading fast, washed thin by rain. But one smaller set remained light, uneven, almost hesitant. Proof that what he'd seen wasn't a fever dream. Proof that something out there had survived. Inside the cabin, life returned to its steady rhythm. He chopped wood, brewed coffee, fixed the fence that winter had torn apart. Yet every sound outside made him pause, the break of a twig, a flutter in the brush. Each noise carried a question he couldn't stop asking himself. Was it still out there? On the 4th morning, he got his answer. The forest was still wrapped in dawn when he stepped onto the porch. Dew clung to the rails. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs. He took a sip of coffee, gaze wandering toward the tree line, and froze. Something moved. Just beyond the fog, near a fallen log, a small gray shape shifted. Not fast, not loud, cautious. Then it stepped into view. The young Bigfoot stood there, half hidden by mist. Its fur had dried, cleaner now, the wounds on its arms scabbing over. Its posture was tense, wary but not panicked, In its hand, it carried something, a bundle of dark berries, still wet with morning dew. Calvin didn't move. The creature hesitated, then set the berries down on the grass. For a long moment, it simply stood there, breathing in slow, shaky intervals. Then, with a quiet rustle, it backed away into the trees. Calvin stared at the small pile glistening in the light. Wild blackberries. He knelt slowly, examining them. Perfectly chosen. Not random. A gift. A faint smile tugged at his lips, the first in years. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, he placed a strip of dried meat on the same spot where the berries had been. He didn't wait or watch. He simply left it there and went back inside. The next morning, it was gone. He found another cluster of berries in its place. And so it began. A quiet exchange. No words. No footsteps shared. Just offerings left between two worlds. Each day, a rhythm formed. Calvin left food at dawn. By dusk, it vanished. In return, there would be something new, a shiny pebble, a small feather, once even a fragment of antler polished smooth. He never heard it approach. The creature moved like mist, soundless, unseen. But its presence filled the forest, subtle and alive. Calvin began to leave the cabin door unlatched. Not wide open, just enough to let in air. And maybe, if it dared, curiosity. At night, when the fire burned low, he sometimes thought he heard soft steps outside, pausing near the porch. He wouldn't move. He didn't want to scare it away. For years, the silence around his cabin had been a curse, heavy, unbroken, the kind that pressed against the ribs until you forgot what laughter sounded like. But now, that same silence felt different, warmer, alive. He found himself speaking again. Not to anyone, just to the empty room. To the ghosts that weren't ghosts anymore. In the silence, he murmured one night, writing in his journal, "I found company from something the world said didn't exist." He paused, pen trembling slightly. Maybe that was the truth of all lonely things, they existed just outside belief. By the 5th day, the creature had grown bolder. Calvin stepped out at twilight to find it standing at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow, half in gold. It watched him quietly, one hand gripping the porch post, ready to flee at any sign of threat. Calvin didn't speak. He reached behind him, grabbed an old wool blanket from a crate by the door, and held it up in both hands. His gesture was slow, deliberate in offering, not a trap. He laid the blanket over the porch railing and stepped back inside, leaving the door slightly open. Through the crack, he watched. Minutes passed. The wind whispered through the pines, stirring the last leaves of fall. Then a soft sound, like fur brushing wood. The creature moved closer, head low, cautious. It sniffed the blanket once, then twice. Its hand trembled as it reached out and pulled the wool close to its chest. Calvin caught a glimpse of its face in the lantern glow, still childlike beneath the wildness, eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, it just stood there, cradling the blanket. Then it turned, slipping back into the mist. Calvin exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were shaking. Trust. That was what had just happened. Not in words, not in understanding, but in the language of shared silence. He sank into the chair by the fire, the warmth spreading through his bones. The night outside hummed with quiet life crickets, wind, distant water. He smiled again, softer this time, like a man remembering what it felt like to belong to something. The war inside him, the noise. The ghosts had started to fade. As he drifted toward sleep, he imagined the creature somewhere out there in the dark, wrapped in that old blanket, safe for the night. The silence that had once haunted the cabin now kept them both company. And in that stillness, Calvin finally understood some connections are not spoken, not planned, not earned. They are simply found, born from compassion, kept alive by quiet trust, and sealed forever in silence. Part 3. The Storm Night. The storm came without warning. By sundown, the air had grown heavy, swollen with the scent of rain and pine sap. Then the clouds split open, and the world turned to chaos. Wind screamed across the ridge, tearing branches from trees. Rain fell in sheets, white and merciless, slapping against the cabin walls like fists. Calvin Hayes sat by the window, lantern flickering beside him. The fire struggled against the drafts, each gust dimming it to a ghostly glow. He glanced toward the clearing, the same spot where the creature usually appeared by dusk. Nothing. The rock where he'd left food was empty. No movement. No sound but the roar of wind. He waited another hour. Then another. Still nothing. The clock ticked loud in the silence between thunderclaps. A knot tightened in his chest. 3 weeks ago, he would have called himself a fool for caring about something the world didn't believe in. But now, every passing minute felt like the edge of an old wound reopening. When lightning cracked across the sky, it lit the tree line for half a heartbeat. That's when he saw it. A faint shape deep in the woods, slumped near the ground. Calvin didn't think. He grabbed his coat, his lantern, and stepped into the storm. The rain hit like shards of glass. Mud sucked at his boots with every step, pulling, holding. He moved by instinct, the same muscle memory that had guided him through the worst nights of war. His lantern swung wildly, casting arcs of gold across the trees. "Come on," he muttered to himself, voice swallowed by the wind. "Where are you, kid?" He pushed deeper, the light trembling in his grasp. The forest had turned into a wall of noise thunder, wind, and the endless hiss of rain. Each flash of lightning revealed brief snapshots, twisted branches, flooded roots, pools of water reflecting his own tired face. Then, a sound. A faint whimper, half drowned by the storm. Calvin froze, tilting his head. Another sound closer this time, weak but alive. He followed it, heart hammering, until he reached a hollow tree that had split in two under the wind. Inside, curled against the mud, was the young Bigfoot. Its fur was plastered to its skin, eyes barely open, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Its breaths came shallow, fast, the pitiful rise and fall of something fighting to stay conscious. "Jesus," Calvin whispered, lowering to his knees. He set the lantern beside them, the flame trembling wildly in the wind. The creature's hand twitched, reaching for him not in fear this time, but in sheer instinct. He didn't hesitate. He tore off his coat, wrapped it around the creature's shoulders, and tried to lift. The mud held on like a living thing, suctioning to every movement. Calvin gritted his teeth, muscles straining. "Not this time," he said through clenched jaw. "I'm not leaving anyone behind again." The rain blurred the world into shades of gray. Calvin's breath came ragged, each step a battle. The creature was heavy, limp in his arms. The storm screamed in his ears, but his mind was somewhere else years back, in another downpour, dragging a wounded soldier through swamp water that smelled of blood and gunpowder. Back then, he hadn't made it in time. The memory burned like lightning behind his eyes. Every scream, every flash of white mud, every heartbeat counting down to regret. But tonight was different. He could still change the ending. He pressed on, the weight in his arms feeling less like burden and more like redemption. When the cabin finally came into view, half hidden by the rain, he nearly fell to his knees. He kicked open the door and stumbled inside, collapsing near the hearth. The creature's body hit the floor softly, coated in mud and trembling from cold. Calvin shut the door against the wind, dropped to his knees, and went to work. He stoked the fire, feeding it until flames leapt bright and alive. Then he stripped away the soaked coat, using his knife to cut away the vines tangled around its injured leg. Beneath the mud, the bone was swollen but not shattered. Maybe a break. Maybe just a deep sprain. He cleaned it carefully, wrapping it with torn strips of cloth. His hands shook the whole time, not from fear, but from the unbearable fragility of the moment. The creature didn't resist. It only breathed shallow, rhythmic, trusting. When he finished, he sat back, drenched and exhausted. The firelight filled the small cabin, painting the walls in gold and shadow. Steam rose from their clothes. The young Bigfoot shivered once, then went still. Its eyes fluttered closed. Its chest rose, fell, rose again slow and even. Calvin leaned against the wall, catching his breath. He couldn't help staring. The creature lay there, wrapped in his coat, its massive hand resting limply on the floorboards. The sight was absurd, surreal, and yet profoundly human. He realized how quiet the world had become. The storm still raged outside, but in that small cabin, there was peace. He reached forward and placed his palm over its chest, feeling the faint thump beneath layers of fur. Steady, alive. A breath he hadn't known he was holding finally escaped his lungs. He whispered, "You made it, kid." The creature didn't stir, but its breathing deepened, syncing with his own. Minutes passed, or maybe hours' time didn't exist anymore. Just the sound of rain, and two hearts beating in rhythm. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the space where fear used to live. Outside, thunder rolled one last time and drifted away toward the horizon. Calvin looked out the window, watching the lightning fade into mist. Then he turned back to the creature, to the impossible life he had somehow become guardian of, and smiled faintly through tired eyes. That night, he would later write in his journal, the forest finally stopped being lonely. Part 4. The Return of the Giant. The storm had passed. Dawn crept slowly through the wreckage it left behind, a soft, silvery light spilling over drenched earth. The forest glistened. Every branch hung with drops that caught the sun and turned to tiny shards of fire. The air smelled clean, raw, and alive. Calvin Hayes stepped out onto the porch, his old flannel shirt clinging to his shoulders. He hadn't slept much. The fire inside had burned low through the night, and the creature had slept soundly by it, wrapped in his coat. Now, in the calm of morning, the cabin felt different, lighter, quieter, the kind of quiet that carried peace instead of loneliness. He looked to his right. The young Bigfoot, smaller than he'd realized now that it stood upright, was by the porch railing. It leaned on the post, unsteady but awake, the bandaged legs stiff beneath its weight. Steam rose from its fur in the cool morning air. Calvin didn't speak. He just watched. The creature gazed out toward the forest, the mist curling around the tree line like a curtain. Its breathing was calm, rhythmic. For the first time, there was no fear in its posture, only patience, as if it were waiting for something. And then, between the trees, movement. A shadow shifted. At first, Calvin thought it was a trick of the mist, but the outline grew clearer, larger, until a figure stepped out of the fog, towering, powerful, unmistakable. The giant Bigfoot. Its fur was darker, streaked with silver down the back. Its shoulders were massive, chest broad, the weight of years carved into its stance. It stood nearly twice the height of the young one, silent and still, framed by shafts of morning light. For a long time, nothing happened. The forest held its breath. The young Bigfoot froze, then straightened. Its chest rose and fell faster, a sound almost like a soft, broken call escaping its throat. The elder answered a deep, low hum that vibrated through the trees like the rumble of earth itself. Calvin felt it in his bones. The younger one turned, glancing back at him. Those wide, amber eyes, once terrified, once pleading, now shone with something else entirely. Understanding. He realized, in that instant, what this was. It wasn't a monster appearing to reclaim its own. It was a parent coming for its child. He swallowed hard. The ache in his chest was unexpected pride and sadness tangled together. The two Bigfoots looked at one another, a silent reunion carved in breath and stillness. Then the elder's gaze shifted directly to Calvin. That stare rooted him where he stood. The creature's eyes were deep, unreadable. But there was no malice there. Just acknowledgement. Two beings, two worlds, both bound by the same unspoken instinct to protect what they love. Calvin felt himself nod slightly. It wasn't a choice, it was a reflex, a language older than words. The elder took a single step forward, then stopped. The earth beneath its feet barely stirred, yet its presence filled the clearing like thunder held back by mercy. The young one turned once more toward Calvin, its breathing steady. Then, slowly, it stepped closer to him. Calvin knelt, heart pounding in quiet reverence. The creature extended one hand, small compared to its kin, but rough and warm. In its palm rested a small, smooth stone, pale gray with a faint etching scratched into the surface, the outline of a tiny hand. Calvin's throat tightened. He looked up. The young Bigfoot made a soft, guttural sound, almost like the sigh of wind through trees, and placed the stone gently into his calloused hand. He didn't move, didn't speak, only stared at the gift, the weight of it far heavier than its size. Behind them, the elder let out a slow, resonant breath. Then, with a motion so deliberate it made Calvin's heart skip, the great creature bowed its head just once. A gesture of gratitude. Calvin blinked, unsure if his tears came from awe or disbelief. The young one looked at him one last time, then turned toward the forest. The elder shifted, stepping aside to let it pass. Together, they melted into the fog, first their shapes, then their shadows, then the sound of their footsteps fading into the heartbeat of the woods. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. Calvin stayed kneeling, staring at the mist long after they vanished. His hand closed around the stone firm, steady, trembling all at once. The carved handprint pressed into his palm, grounding him to this moment, this miracle. He exhaled, a weary smile breaking through the tired lines of his face. The sunlight reached the porch then, warm and golden, brushing over his shoulder like a benediction. He whispered to the trees, voice rough, but full. Guess he had someone waiting for him after all. The wind shifted through the forest, carrying no answer, only the soft murmur of leaves swaying like a promise. Calvin stood, the stone still clutched tight in his fist. His hand closed around it the way a man holds onto faith, not to possess it, but to remember. The mist began to lift, the forest glowing alive under new light, and for the first time in years, the rancher didn't feel like the only soul left in the world. In the quiet dawn after the storm, two worlds had met and neither had walked away unchanged. Part 5. The Sound of Leaves. A week had passed since the morning they vanished into the mist. The forest had gone still again, not the haunting kind of still, but the quiet that comes after understanding. The rains had washed the mud away. The paths were dry, and sunlight spilled through the trees in gentle streaks. Every morning, golden leaves drifted down from the oaks and gathered along the porch like memories that refused to leave. Calvin Hayes sat where he always did, at his old wooden desk near the window. The air inside the cabin carried the faint scent of smoke and pine. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't mind. The fire in the stove burned steady, low enough to warm, not to command. He opened his worn leather journal, the one that had followed him from the war, the one that held every ghost and miracle his hands had touched. Pages filled with handwriting scrawled by years of solitude. He turned to a blank sheet. For a moment, he hesitated. What could he possibly write to make sense of what had happened? Finally, the pen began to move, slow but certain. Some secrets. He wrote, his voice low as if speaking to the room itself, are not meant to be feared, but protected. He sat back, letting the words settle. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a cascade of leaves spiraling through the yard. They moved like dancers, quiet, effortless, free. Calvin smiled faintly. He hadn't realized how light he felt until now. The weight he'd carried for years, the guilt, the silence, the solitude it had lifted, almost imperceptibly. What replaced it wasn't joy, exactly, but peace. Forgiveness for the past, for himself, for the things he could never explain. He leaned back in his chair, looking out across the tree line where fog once swallowed the world whole. The sun was rising there now, soft gold melting into the blue of a new morning. Then, from somewhere deep within the forest, he heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy, thunderous kind that made the earth tremble, no. These were gentle, slow, deliberate, like someone walking without hurry, without fear. They didn't approach. They didn't retreat. Just passed by, lingering in rhythm with the breeze. Calvin didn't move. He only listened. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath again, The same stillness he had once mistaken for loneliness now felt like a conversation, an exchange of quiet gratitude. He whispered into that silence, half a prayer, half a farewell. You're safe out there, both of you. A faint rustle answered, as if the wind itself nodded in return. Calvin smiled the kind of smile that comes not from happiness, but from release. He closed the journal and set it beside the stone the creature had left him. The tiny carved handprint caught the morning light, glowing faintly against the wood. He reached out, traced it once with his thumb, and whispered, "Not all strange things are monsters." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the leaves across the clearing. They whispered through the air like voices too old for words, carrying both farewell and promise. The camera, if there had been one, would have drifted back then, away from the porch, rising above the cabin roof where the chimney smoke twined with mist. The forest stretched endless, ancient, breathing in golden light. The faint sound of a wooden chair creaking, a page turning, the steady beat of two hearts once connected across the impossible, all faded into the distance. And then, only the music remained, a slow guitar, soft and earthy, a cello, low and warm, pulsing like the rhythm of breath. Together they carried the story not to end it, but to let it rest. Because some stories, like the sound of leaves in autumn, are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be felt, to heal, to remind us that somewhere out there in the wild, kindness still walks quietly, unseen, and sometimes it leaves a handprint behind. Night returned to the valley like a slow breath. The storm had long passed, leaving only the soft hum of crickets and the whisper of pine needles swaying in the dark. Inside the cabin, the fire had died down to embers. Calvin Hayes sat in his chair by the window, a notebook open on his lap. The words were finished. Everything that needed saying was already written. He reached for the small stone lying beside him, its surface smooth, cool, etched with the faint imprint of a childlike hand. Gently, he placed it on the windowsill where the moonlight could find it. The silver glow traced every groove, turning it into something alive. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The forest outside breathed with him, slow, steady, familiar. Somewhere far beyond the tree line, he imagined soft footsteps fading into peace. His voice, low and steady, carried through the stillness. Sometimes, what we fear the most is the only thing that truly hears us. He smiled faintly, the sound of the wind his only reply. If you believe kindness can reach even the wildest souls, hit follow. I've got more stories to tell. The screen fades to black. Only the sound of leaves remains.